Hey guys, tonight we ease into a story that drifts somewhere between glowing grandeur and clumsy comedy. Imagine Apollo, the radiant god of the sun, music, poetry, and all things elegant, suddenly plopped into a muddy field, trying to manage cows that refused to cooperate. The golden chariot driver, the lyre player, the prophet of Delphi, reduced to chasing livestock that don't care about celestial harmony. You probably won't survive this level of second-hand embarrassment, but don't worry, we'll go gently. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love for you to post your location and local time in the comments. I always find it fascinating to see where and when people are listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture him first the way the poets usually describe him: shining hair, bright eyes, a figure you'd expect to see standing atop marble steps, lyre in hand. But not tonight. Tonight you drop him into a pasture, sunlight catching on cow horns instead of temple spires, his sandals already looking a little worse for wear. You trudge alongside him, watching as his polished aura collides with the squelch of mud. Cattle herding, after all, was not supposed to be part of Apollo's divine resume. His usual domains were lofty. Prophecy at Delphi, healing, music so perfect it made mortals cry. Herding was left to mortals, or at most rustic gods like Pan. And yet here he is, robe hitched up awkwardly, trying to keep his divine dignity while a cow deliberately wanders off toward a patch of wildflowers. A mainstream fact helps ground you here. In ancient Greek culture, cattle symbolized wealth and power. They weren't just mooing background noise, they were essentially walking banks. Herding them might not be glamorous, but it was essential. To have cattle meant you had resources, alliances, and clout. Even a god recognized their importance. The quirky tidbit: some vase paintings actually show gods in less than glorious roles, hinting that the Greeks enjoyed imagining their immortals fumbling through ordinary chores. Apollo in a pasture would have amused them the way we laugh at memes of superheroes struggling with grocery bags. It reminded mortals that even deities could look a little ridiculous when pulled into earthy duties. Historians still argue whether the story of Apollo and the cows was ever meant to be taken seriously, or if it was largely a comic side note in the broader myth cycle. Was this tale an origin myth for Hermes' cleverness, or was it a gentle way of poking fun at Apollo's perfection? The debate continues, but either way, you find yourself enjoying the dissonance. A glowing god versus stubborn livestock. Apollo raises his hand, maybe expecting the cows to obey like mortals did when he commanded an oracle. The cows, naturally, ignore him. One scratches its head against a tree, another bellows impatiently, and one particularly bold calf noses into Apollo's robe as if searching for snacks. You watch him stiffen, cheeks coloring, not with divine fire but with embarrassment. Somewhere surely another god is watching. Probably Dionysus, already making jokes about offering wine to cows just to watch Apollo struggle. The sun slants low, catching Apollo's golden hair in a halo, but instead of glorious majesty, the effect is more like someone who overdressed for the wrong occasion. You can almost hear him muttering under his breath, trying to frame this as noble work. A true god masters all arts, even bovine management. But his tone convinces no one, least of all the cows now shuffling stubbornly into the wrong direction. You plod after him, sandals collecting grit, the evening air filled with the low drone of insects. The contrast is sharp. Divine light against pastoral monotony, celestial music traded for cowbells. Yet there's something calming in the absurdity. The god of poetry trying to wave cows into line is strangely reassuring. If even Apollo can have an off night, you too are allowed to be imperfect. The air cools as dusk settles, crickets humming like a natural chorus. Apollo exhales, frustration mixing with resignation. His herd is scattered, his dignity dented, but the stars overhead blink into view as if mocking gently. The world, it seems, doesn't bend perfectly even for gods. And so you watch him trudge through the pasture, the golden glow of his presence dimmed just enough to feel human, his story ready to stumble into the mischief that awaits. You keep walking beside Apollo as the air grows heavier with twilight. He's trying to compose himself, brushing dirt from his robe with exaggerated dignity, though the smear across his sleeve only grows larger. The cows seem to sense his irritation. which of course encourages them to wander even farther. One particularly sassy one plants its hooves firmly in the mud and stares him down like it knows exactly how little authority he actually has. Now here's where the real twist enters. Apollo's cattle weren't just any ordinary herd. These were special animals, radiant with a divine quality that set them apart from the average bovine plodding around Greek hillsides. Myth tells us that Hermes, the clever trickster still swaddled in divine babyhood, decided to steal them. Yes, a newborn god, barely out of the celestial cradle, would orchestrate one of the boldest cattle heists in Olympus. Imagine Apollo's humiliation, losing his sacred herd not to a rival war god or to some monstrous beast, but to an infant who should have been napping. This is one of those classic Greek tales that scholars love to debate. Historians still argue whether this story reflects ancient concerns about property rights, or whether it was simply a playful myth meant to highlight Hermes' craftiness. Some even suggest it reflects a deeper anxiety about the transfer of power between older and younger gods. But tonight, you're not analyzing, you're just walking with Apollo through the field, waiting for the chaos to unfold. A mainstream fact slots in neatly here. Cattle theft wasn't a joke in ancient societies. Herds could be raided, and entire conflicts would erupt over stolen livestock. In Homer's Iliad, cattle raids are mentioned as the kind of provocation that led to skirmishes and feuds. So while the image of Hermes tiptoeing off with cows might sound comedic to you, it echoed real-world anxieties about wealth and survival. And then the quirky tidbit. According to some versions, Hermes didn't just steal the cattle. He walked them backward, so their hoofprints seemed to lead in the opposite direction. Yes, imagine a celestial baby god taking the time to invent reverse cow walking as his great master plan. This absurd detail delights storytellers because it shows Hermes wasn't just mischievous, he was inventively mischievous. Reverse tracks, baby swaddles, stolen cows, the full package. Meanwhile, Apollo remains in the dark, literally and figuratively. He's standing in the field, attempting to hum a tune on his lyre to calm the herd. The cows, unimpressed, continue their slow-motion rebellion. A lowing chorus fills the valley, sounding more like hecklers at a bad open mic night than a peaceful pastoral scene. The lyre, so often the symbol of divine harmony, seems tragically mismatched to the situation. You almost feel embarrassed for him, like watching a superstar attempt karaoke and completely missing the pitch. He squints toward the horizon, something's off. You notice it too, shadows shifting where no shadows should be. The herd feels restless, and somewhere beyond the grove of olive trees, you think you glimpse movement, a small, darting figure. Of course, you know who it is. Hermes, already plotting, already playing his cosmic prank, but Apollo hasn't caught on yet. He thinks he's merely dealing with obstinate cattle. You want to tap him on the shoulder and whisper, "Hey, you're about to be outwitted by a baby," but you let the scene unfold. It's oddly calming, this slow burn of tension. Apollo, golden hair catching the last rays of the sun, cows lowing in disharmony, the night air alive with crickets. The world feels steady, rhythmic, almost lulling. And yet, tucked beneath it all, you sense the coming comedy. Because once those cows vanish, Apollo's irritation will spiral into a blend of divine outrage and almost slapstick desperation. For now, though, he adjusts the strap of his lyre, sighs deeply, and mutters about the decline of mortal respect for the gods. You almost laugh. The cows never respected anyone in the first place. Perhaps that's the quiet lesson hiding in this moment. No matter how radiant your aura, you can't charm livestock into obedience. Even gods must trudge, stumble, and sigh. The sky deepens into indigo, and you feel the story stretching out ahead of you like a path into the night. Hermes waits somewhere in the shadows, cows ready for mischief. Apollo about to learn the art of divine humility in the most inconvenient way possible. You breathe in the cool air, the faint smell of earth and hay grounding you, as the absurdity continues to unfold. You don't even need to blink before the trick is underway. One moment Apollo's herd is clustered loosely in the field, tails flicking against the evening flies, and the next moment they're shuffling awkwardly into formation as if compelled by an unseen hand. Except it's not a hand. It's a very determined baby god. Hermes, still wrapped in the trappings of infancy, has slipped from his cradle and decided that tonight's extracurricular activity involves theft on a scale no babysitter could anticipate. Imagine the scene. the god of boundaries, trade, and mischief, barely old enough to toddle, yet already plotting like a career criminal. According to the myth, Hermes wrapped the cow's hooves in leafy branches to disguise their prints, and then drove them backward so the trail would mislead anyone foolish enough to track them. The mental image is deliciously absurd, an infant coaxing cattle like he's starring in the ancient world's strangest talent show. You can almost hear the modern announcer. Next up in the category of divine pranks, baby Hermes with the backward cow parade. This is where you get to savor one of those strange but true details. Mainstream historians agree Hermes was the patron of travelers, thieves, and cunning speech. But quirky tradition paints him as the first inventor of the fire drill. Yes, not the emergency evacuation kind, but the tool for making fire by friction. Some versions of the cattle story claim that after stealing Apollo's herd, Hermes used the occasion to demonstrate this invention. It's as though he thought, stealing cows isn't enough. I should also revolutionize basic survival skills while I'm at it. Now, whether Hermes actually invented fire-making is one of those topics where historians still argue. Some scholars dismiss it as myth layered onto myth, while others insist it reflects oral traditions crediting gods with key technologies. The debate itself becomes oddly soothing, like overhearing two scholars locked in a library at midnight, bickering in hushed tones about whether a baby invented camping gear. Meanwhile, Apollo remains none the wiser. You picture him still plucking his lyre at the edge of the pasture, trying to serenade cows that are rapidly disappearing into Hermes' makeshift disguise operation. Every twang of the string sounds more mournful, almost like a soundtrack to his impending embarrassment. He hasn't noticed the herd thinning, hasn't realized that the cows are now forming a line like schoolchildren sneaking out the back door. And then a little aside just for you. Cows aren't exactly subtle creatures. They're large, clumsy, and loud. The fact that Hermes managed to get dozens of them to walk backward without attracting immediate suspicion might be the most divine miracle in this entire myth. Forget turning water into wine or parting seas. Reverse cow choreography deserves its own place in history. You follow Hermes in your mind's eye as he hustles the herd across meadows, through streams, leaving behind a trail that's anything but straightforward. The sound of hooves muffled by branches, the lowing muffled as if the cows themselves know they're accomplices in mischief. You almost expect Hermes to shush them with a baby's pacifier. But let's linger on one historical anchor. In ancient Greece, cattle symbolized wealth and status. They were more than food, they were markers of power, part of sacrifice rituals and currency in certain transactions. To lose them wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating. So Hermes wasn't just pranking his older half-brother. He was striking directly at Apollo's sense of pride and divine authority. For a culture that measured worth in cattle, this theft was a cosmic insult. And yet you're lulled by the rhythm of it all. The slow shuffle of hooves, the rustle of leaves tied to their feet, Hermes' soft giggles carried on the night air. It feels almost hypnotic, like listening to a lullaby played in reverse. There's comedy here, yes, but also a strange serenity. The kind of absurd detail that makes your eyelids heavier as you imagine each backward step into the darkness. Apollo will eventually realize what's happened, but for now you stay with Hermes. You watch him lead the herd into a hidden cave, the animals lowing softly as though they, too, are in on the joke. He pats one on the nose, tiny god hands against a massive bovine muzzle, and beams with mischief. The absurdity hits again, a baby corralling sacred cows into secrecy. If the gods weren't immortal, you'd say Apollo probably won't survive this embarrassment. You yawn, feeling the gentle cadence of the story settle in. The crickets still hum outside Apollo's field, the stars prick through the night sky, and Hermes curls up in the cave beside his prize. The cows, restless at first, begin to calm, chewing cud like nothing unusual has happened. And maybe, in a way, nothing has. After all, for the Greek gods, chaos was just another form of bedtime routine. The first clue doesn't come with a crash or a roar, it comes with silence. Apollo strums another note on his lyre, waiting for the cow's answering shuffle of hooves, the steady chewing sounds, the occasional deep bovine sigh. Nothing. It's the pastoral equivalent of realizing your phone is missing only when the pocket feels suspiciously light. You picture him pausing mid-song, frowning, and then turning his head slowly, the way anyone does when the background noise has gone too quiet. And then comes the realization. The cows are gone, not one or two strays but the entire herd. Apollo springs to his feet, golden hair flashing in the starlight, and begins pacing the field like someone who left their groceries on the roof of their car. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's an insult. For a god associated with order, music, and prophecy, losing track of cows is like a Nobel Prize winner accidentally locking themselves out of their office. Apollo starts looking for tracks. Surely cows leave a mess behind. Muddy prints, grass torn by hooves, clumps of hair snagged on branches. But when he scans the ground, what he finds makes less sense than a toddler's drawing. The prints are there, yes, but they face the wrong direction. Hoof marks point toward the pasture, not away from it, as if the cows had politely returned themselves and then vanished into thin air. This, of course, is Hermes' genius. Remember those leafy branches tied to hooves? They make the trail look like a messy brushstroke, more forest than cow. Apollo crouches down, squints at the ground, and probably mutters something divine but not exactly printable. You follow his frustration as he traces the nonsensical path, circling one way, then another, like a GPS constantly recalculating. Mainstream accounts describe Hermes' backward trick in detail. It's one of the earliest literary examples of deliberate track tampering. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some variations say Hermes even made the cows walk sideways, crab-like, to add extra confusion. Imagine trying to herd a sideways walking cow. That's not just mischief, that's choreography. If Broadway existed in 8th century BCE Greece, Hermes would have been its director. Historians still argue whether the backward hoofprint story was symbolic, representing Hermes as the god who flips boundaries and reverses expectations, or if storytellers just thought it was a funny gag. Either way, the debate itself adds to your drowsy amusement. Nothing says bedtime story like a group of classicists insisting, no, the baby god definitely made the cows moonwalk. Apollo stomps farther, following the absurd path. Each step takes him deeper into confusion and further from patience. He checks the riverbank. Hoofprints point upstream, though the water clearly flows down. He checks the meadow. Branches are broken as if a herd passed, but the grazing looks untouched. It's like trying to solve a mystery written by someone who dropped the pages in the wrong order. And you can't help smiling at the thought. Apollo, radiant god of light, undone by a baby with a leafy arts and crafts project. This is the same Apollo who will one day be worshipped at Delphi, delivering prophecies in hushed tones. Yet here he is, muttering about cows, dirt under his divine fingernails, probably swatting mosquitoes. Not exactly the godly glamour he's known for. A historical pause. Cattle in Greek ritual weren't just wealth, they were central to sacrifice. Festivals involved parading herds, choosing the finest, and offering them to the gods with solemn ceremony. To misplace them wasn't just a personal blunder, it had religious consequences. Losing a herd meant rituals delayed, sacrifices spoiled, prestige dented. No wonder Apollo is fuming. This isn't just about cows, it's about cosmic reputation. Still, the comedy outweighs the tragedy. You imagine Apollo crouching, examining one print after another, while somewhere nearby Hermes is probably giggling behind his chubby infant hands. The backward trail leads him not to clarity but to further absurdity. You can almost hear Apollo muttering, "Cows don't do this, they don't walk backward, they don't sidestep like dancers." Unless, and then trailing off, because admitting he's been duped by an infant isn't exactly confidence-boosting. And yet the rhythm of the search lulls you, step after step, like walking a labyrinth with no center. The soft crunch of Apollo's sandals on dirt, the swish of tall grass brushing against his robes, the sigh of wind through olive branches, it all feels repetitive, hypnotic. Even his frustration has a sleepy cadence, a muttered chorus of disbelief that repeats with each misdirected print. When Apollo finally throws up his hands, you can almost hear the sigh, half divine thunder, half human exasperation. The stars glitter overhead, the moon looks down with no answers, and the god of light has to admit he's been thoroughly, embarrassingly bamboozled. Somewhere in the distance, the cows are safely hidden, chewing cud like they've never been more content. And Hermes, swaddled in innocence, waits in the shadows for Apollo to come storming in the wrong direction. You picture Apollo, arms crossed, jaw tight, muttering to himself as he trudges along the baffling trail. His sandals scuff the dirt, his golden hair catches stray beams of moonlight, and his patience, already thin, wears down like sandals on gravel. Somewhere ahead Hermes has tucked the cows away, their lowing muffled, their tracks thoroughly disguised. And for all his godly brilliance, Apollo is left chasing shadows and guessing at riddles. He knows this isn't chance. This reeks of trickery. He pauses, scanning the horizon, his sharp eyes narrowing. Maybe he even whispers to himself, which of the gods would dare? It's a short-list Hera. No, she's more into long-term schemes. Dionysus. Too busy with wine, Hermes. Well, he's new, barely born, not even on the radar of serious suspects. And yet, that's exactly where the finger should point. By now Apollo has retraced the false tracks so many times he could sketch them from memory. It's like walking through a maze where every turn ends in another cow-sized riddle. The air cools, the night deepens, and the silence gnaws at him. No hooves, no bells, no soft breathing of cattle. Just frogs croaking at the river and crickets grinding their endless lullaby. Frustrated, he does what many of us would. He stops dead in his tracks and calls out, "Show yourself." His voice echoes, bouncing off rocks and trees, startling an owl that takes flight with a silent swoop. But no cow emerges, no thief stumbles guiltily out of the brush. The night swallows his demand. In myth, Apollo often represents clarity, light, music, prophecy. Yet here clarity deserts him. The irony is delicious. The god who helps mortals see the future can't even see where his own cows have gone. You imagine him kicking a stone, wincing when it ricochets into his shin, muttering under his breath, "Gods, they're just like us." And this is where the story takes a more human turn. Instead of divine lightning bolts or instant omniscience, Apollo has to do the boring detective work. He bends down, fingertips brushing the dirt, looking for broken twigs, displaced stones, signs of passage. It's the kind of tedious investigation farmers and shepherds have done for millennia. The mainstream historical fact here: herding cultures often developed astonishing tracking skills, reading bent grass and faint prints the way we scroll phone screens. Apollo, for all his glory, now joins that tradition, squinting at blades of grass under moonlight like a puzzled shepherd. But even the sharpest tracker can be undone by a baby god with a sense of humor. The backward hoofprints taunt him. They're deliberate, almost cheeky, pointing in directions that no cow would logically go. Some versions say Hermes even braided the cows' tails together, so they'd walk in pairs, confusing the tracks further. It's one part practical joke, one part avant-garde art installation. You almost feel sorry for Apollo, following a herd that looks like it moonwalked through the fields in a conga line. Historians still argue whether this episode was meant as a playful satire of Apollo's seriousness, or as a foundational myth to explain Hermes' role as god of thieves. Maybe both. The debate continues in dusty university halls, scholars scribbling notes while you picture Apollo, exasperated, tripping over yet another misleading branch. And still he presses on because that's what gods, and honestly, stubborn humans, do. He wades through tall grass, the blades whispering against his legs. He crouches near the river, dipping his fingers into the cool water, checking for stirred mud. He peers into thickets, startling rabbits who dart out like streaks of shadow. His search is relentless, but the cows remain maddeningly absent. The night feels longer with each step, stretching like an elastic band. Apollo's luminous aura lights his path, but it doesn't lighten his mood. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you compare him to someone who's lost their Wi-Fi connection. Frustration mounts not because the cows are gone, but because the mystery itself mocks him. And then comes the suspicion, sharp and unavoidable. This isn't just any thief. This is divine work. He mutters Hermes' name aloud for the first time, almost testing the possibility. The godling who was born yesterday, literally, couldn't possibly pull this off. Or could he? It's the classic sibling frustration. The older brother, polished and perfect, suddenly blindsided by the bratty younger one who gets away with chaos because he's just a baby. You almost sympathize with Apollo's indignation. He, a mature god, dragged through fields and rivers like a hapless mortal, while a swaddled toddler laughs from the shadows. There's something lulling in the repetition of his search. The circling, the bending, the checking again. The rhythm of futility is oddly soothing, like the looping sound of waves or the steady tick of a clock. You can almost feel your eyes drooping as Apollo retraces yet another pointless circle, his divine glow flickering in the endless dark. But Apollo's persistence begins to harden into resolve. Enough is enough. If mortal methods won't reveal the truth, divine ones will. His suspicion of Hermes crystallizes into certainty, and with certainty comes fury. He straightens up, his back taut, his expression sharp. Somewhere far off, Hermes' tiny laugh might still echo, but Apollo's lips curl into a thin smile. If Hermes thinks this prank ends here, he's sorely mistaken. So Apollo stops searching the field. He turns his steps instead toward Olympus, ready to storm into the halls of the gods with a complaint that no one will be able to ignore. The cows may be hidden, but the thief cannot hide forever. You trail behind Apollo as he storms away from the empty fields, sandals slapping the earth, robes swishing like curtains caught in a draft. His patience has snapped, and when divine patience runs out, Olympus usually hears about it. The backward hoofprints are no longer a puzzle to solve, they're evidence of insult. Apollo knows who's behind this, and now he wants witnesses. The path toward Olympus winds upward, starlight stretching across the peaks. You picture him marching past groves of olive trees, past shrines flickering with oil lamps, his jaw set, muttering under his breath like someone rehearsing a complaint for customer service. Except instead of "my internet went out again," it's "a literal baby stole my cows." Hard to say which gets less sympathy. And yet, even Apollo knows appearances matter. He adjusts his stride, lifts his chin, makes sure he looks every inch the wronged god. If he's about to accuse a newborn, he needs gravitas. Imagine the sight: golden-haired Apollo, radiant as dawn, barging into divine halls to rat out a child swaddled in cloth. It's equal parts majestic and ridiculous. Inside Olympus, the air shimmers with incense and chatter. Gods recline on couches, sipping nectar, trading gossip. Apollo doesn't bother with pleasantries. He bursts in, voice raised, demanding attention. "My cattle," he declares, "have been stolen, and the culprit is Hermes." A hush falls. Some gods blink in confusion. Others snicker. You can almost hear Ares choking on his drink, Hera raising an eyebrow, Aphrodite covering a laugh with her hand. The room ripples with amusement. Apollo, mighty Apollo, accusing a baby. This is the moment when myth becomes comedy theater. Mainstream retellings emphasize the absurd contrast, one of the most revered gods of order pointing a trembling finger at a newborn. And the quirky tidbit here: some ancient plays even staged this scene, with an actor dressed as Apollo fuming while another in baby costume feigned innocence. Imagine the roaring laughter in the amphitheater. But here in Olympus, it's not laughter Apollo wants. He demands justice. He paints the picture: the backward hoofprints, the vanished herd, the unmistakable mischief. His voice sharpens, his glow intensifies as though sheer authority could bulldoze doubt. And then comes the best part. Hermes is brought forward, or perhaps he toddles in, clutching his swaddling cloth, big eyes blinking as though he just woke from a nap. He looks angelic, cheeks round, hair tousled. The gods chuckle at the sight. This the accused cattle thief. He can barely sit upright. Apollo seethes. "Don't be fooled," he insists. "He may look like an infant, but he's cunning. He reversed the prince. He led them away. He thinks himself clever, but I know the truth." Hermes, of course, denies everything. He wails that he's just a baby, innocent of such schemes. Some versions of the myth describe him lying outright, claiming he doesn't even know what cows are. You imagine the high-pitched baby voice insisting, "Me, steal cattle. I was literally born yesterday." It's weaponized adorableness. Historians still argue whether this denial was meant as a satire of courtroom antics or as a myth explaining why Hermes later became the god of rhetoric and persuasion. Either way, the scene plays out like the first-ever legal drama, except with Olympians as the jury and a newborn defendant. Zeus, presiding over the squabble, suppresses a smile. He knows Hermes is clever, probably proud of him. But he listens as Apollo fumes, as Hermes protests, as the gods murmur among themselves. The tension crackles, half serious, half comedic. You sense that Apollo, for all his righteous anger, is outmatched, not by strength, but by sheer absurdity. And you feel the humor drift over you like a lull. The idea of Apollo pacing, pointing, scolding, while Hermes bats his eyelashes and insists on his innocence, is both silly and strangely soothing. It's the rhythm of opposites, seriousness and play, order and chaos, woven together in a story that's been told for centuries, bedtime ready without even trying. At last, Zeus raises a hand, his booming voice cutting through the laughter. He demands proof, resolution. Apollo, teeth clenched, points to Hermes again. And Hermes, smirking just enough to be dangerous, knows the game isn't over yet. Apollo may have made his accusation, but the trickster isn't finished. Zeus doesn't rush to judgment. He's too experienced, too entertained, and frankly too amused by the whole scene to cut it short. You picture him lounging on his high seat, lightning bolt propped casually against his side, pretending to look stern while his lips twitch toward a grin. Around him the other gods murmur and chuckle, enjoying the spectacle of Apollo, the golden boy, the straight-laced perfectionist, losing his temper over cows. Hermes, swaddled in cloth that he probably arranged himself for dramatic flair, sits on the floor like the picture of innocence. His tiny toes wiggle, his chubby hands pat at the marble, and his round cheeks glow like butter in candlelight. He couldn't possibly have done it, could he? That's the performance. And Apollo, pacing like a lawyer who's had too much coffee, keeps pointing and insisting, "It's him. Don't be fooled." The trial begins in earnest. Zeus asks Hermes what he has to say for himself. Hermes blinks, tilts his head, and launches into a speech that would put modern politicians to shame. He insists he's far too young to understand theft. He claims he can't even walk properly, let alone herd cows. Some versions of the myth say he even swears by the gods that he's innocent, an oath delivered with the wide-eyed sincerity only a baby could pull off. Mainstream scholars note this moment as an early example of Hermes' skill in rhetoric. The god of speech and persuasion is already showing his chops, turning lies into lullabies, weaving denial into an art form. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest Hermes threw in random distractions, like humming tunes, pointing at passing birds, or babbling nonsense to make Apollo look unreasonable. Imagine a divine toddler shouting, "Look, shiny," every time the conversation got too close to the truth. Apollo, unsurprisingly, grows more agitated. He waves his arms, his lyre slung awkwardly across his shoulder, his golden aura flaring like a migraine. He insists he saw the backward prints, the broken branches, the clear evidence of foul play. The more worked up he gets, the calmer Hermes becomes, his baby face a perfect mask of innocence. It's the first courtroom comedy in myth, with roles so neatly drawn you'd think Aristophanes had scripted it. Historians still argue whether this trial was a parody of actual Greek legal practices. Some point out that swearing oaths, calling for witnesses, and appealing to authority all mirror courtroom rituals of the time. Others think it was pure farce, a bedtime story spun to amuse listeners with the ridiculous idea of a god defending himself with the excuse, "I literally can't walk yet." As you drift along with the narrative, the rhythm of the back and forth becomes almost hypnotic. Apollo's voice rising, Hermes' voice softening, Zeus occasionally booming for order. It's like waves lapping against a shore, predictable, repetitive, strangely soothing. You can almost close your eyes and imagine sitting in Olympus Marble Hall, the air scented with ambrosia, the laughter of gods echoing like lullabies. Eventually, Zeus grows tired of the theatrics. He may be indulgent, but he's not blind. He knows Hermes is guilty. The sparkle in the baby's eyes gives it away. But instead of punishing him outright, Zeus does what every parent does when their mischievous child has been caught. He smirks, shakes his head, and orders them to work it out. "Return the cattle," Zeus says, his tone equal parts stern and indulgent. Apollo stiffens, triumphant. Hermes sighs dramatically, as though the weight of the cosmos is upon his tiny shoulders. He agrees, sort of. He'll take Apollo to the herd. But he's not done playing yet, and you sense Apollo's victory will not be as simple as it seems. The gods, still chuckling, drift back to their nectar and gossip. Apollo, jaw tight, gestures for Hermes to lead the way. Hermes stretches, yawns, and toddles forward with exaggerated slowness, milking every ounce of drama. It's a small child stalling bedtime, except instead of brushing teeth, he's returning stolen livestock. And as they leave Olympus together, the trial unresolved in spirit if not in judgment, you sense that the trickster has only just begun weaving his mischief. You follow Apollo and Hermes as they descend from Olympus, the great marble halls shrinking behind them, the mountain path winding like a silver ribbon down toward the pastures. Apollo strides with all the righteous indignation of a wronged older sibling, his sandals slapping the stone as if every step were an exclamation point. Hermes, meanwhile, drifts along with the unhurried gait of a toddler who knows he's still in control. His eyes sparkle. His grin keeps peeking out from behind the mask of contrition. The two could not be more different, Apollo radiating golden seriousness, Hermes carrying the air of someone who just pulled off the prank of the millennium. The scene almost feels like a comedy sketch. A god of music and law escorted by a baby trickster in a swaddling cloth, marching toward a herd of cows that shouldn't even be his problem. When they finally reach the meadow, Apollo's herd is there, but not quite as he left it. The cows look freshly arranged, their tracks wiped clean, the landscape suspiciously orderly. Hermes even now has tidied up the evidence with the care of a child wiping cookie crumbs off his chin while still smelling of chocolate. Apollo narrows his eyes, scanning the ground, but the backward hoofprints from before have faded. Hermes shrugs innocently as though saying, "See, what cows?" Here comes the twist. Instead of dragging the cattle back with sulking obedience, Hermes changes the game entirely. He casually produces something small and strange, a handful of reeds, some gut strings, a turtle shell. With a flick of his tiny hands, he fashions the lyre, the first musical instrument of its kind. Out of Mischief comes invention, as if stealing cows were merely the warm-up act. The sound fills the air, and it's unlike anything Apollo has ever heard. A trembling sweetness, a resonance that echoes off the hillsides. For all his rage, Apollo cannot help but pause, listening, his heart skipping to the rhythm. Hermes plucks and strums with a grin so wide you almost hear it between the notes. Mainstream historians mark this as one of the great cultural myths of invention, the story of how the lyre, symbol of harmony and divine music, entered the world. But here's the quirky tidbit. In some versions, Hermes actually killed and hollowed a tortoise for the shell, which makes the lyre's soothing tones a little more macabre if you think too hard about it. The Greeks were never afraid to mix beauty with something unsettling, much like putting olives in desserts. It doesn't quite make sense, but they did it anyway. Apollo, though enchanted, is not ready to forgive so easily. His cows were stolen after all, and he's not about to trade them away for a lullaby. Yet the music tugs at him, softening the edge of his temper. You imagine him standing there, arms crossed, trying to look unimpressed while his foot betrays him, tapping lightly to the beat. Historians still argue whether this scene represents a broader cultural message. Was the myth suggesting that art and invention can pacify even the strictest forms of authority? Or was it simply a playful story explaining why Apollo, the god of music, didn't invent his own instrument? Either way, the moral seems clear enough. You can steal cows, but if you give your victim a good tune, maybe they'll let it slide. Hermes watches Apollo's reaction closely. You can picture his smug little face, the way kids watch adults when they know they've gotten away with something. The sound of the lyre drifts across the fields, mingling with the mooing of cows, and the world suddenly feels less tense. Apollo sighs long and dramatic, like a parent realizing their punishment is about to turn into a negotiation. "Fine," you can almost hear him mutter. "Maybe you're clever. Maybe you're more than a thief." And in that sigh is the faintest crack in his armor. The meadow grows still. The cows chew calmly. The breeze carries a whisper of strings, a melody that seems eternal, like the first lullaby hummed across the world. And in that moment, Apollo begins to see Hermes not just as a nuisance, but as someone who might have something worth keeping. The air hums with the strange resonance of Hermes' lyre, the notes floating upward like smoke from an invisible fire. You trail along behind Apollo, who now finds himself caught between indignation and admiration. He wanted justice. Instead, he's getting a private concert performed by a god who can barely walk without tripping over his own swaddle. Apollo leans closer, his face softening despite himself. You can almost hear the mental battle raging inside. Part of him wants to scold Hermes until Olympus echoes with it, but another part is enchanted by this brand new sound. Music has power, and even Apollo, patron of harmony, song, and poetry, didn't expect to hear something that could surprise him. Hermes notices the effect and leans in further, plucking strings with exaggerated flourish, each note dripping with theatrical innocence. The cows perk up their ears, tails swishing in rhythm. One even lets out a low moo at just the right moment, and Hermes, without missing a beat, incorporates it into the tune like a perfectly timed drum hit. You almost laugh out loud, imagining Apollo struggling not to crack a smile. And then comes the negotiation. Hermes pauses dramatically, letting the last note linger in the breeze. He tilts his head toward Apollo, tiny but unflinching, and says, "I'll give you this instrument if you forget about the cows." bold doesn't even cover it. Here is a newborn god, barely a day old, essentially bartering his way out of punishment with nothing more than a turtle shell and some strings. Apollo bristles naturally. His golden aura tightens, his eyes narrowing like rays of focused sunlight. "Forget the cows," he seems to growl. "Those cows are mine." But notice how he doesn't say no to the lyre. For a moment, you can sense the calculation. Weigh the worth of 50 cattle against the shimmering promise of the very first stringed instrument. Even a god of order has to pause at that. Here's where mythology blurs into philosophy. Some scholars interpret this moment as a parable about exchange, the dawn of commerce itself, with Hermes, the god of trade, offering the world's first barter deal. Others argue it symbolizes the triumph of creativity over possession, art over livestock. And of course, historians still argue whether the myth originated as an actual cult tale to explain ritual instruments, or if it was just the ancient Greeks' version of "look how cheeky our gods can be." What isn't up for debate is Apollo's fascination. He eventually takes the lyre into his hands, and suddenly the music shifts. What Hermes played with mischief, Apollo plays with mastery. His fingers glide across the strings, and the meadow becomes a concert hall. The cows settle, lulled into docility, tails wagging like sleepy metronomes. Hermes, sitting smugly on a rock, nods approvingly, as if he'd planned this exact outcome all along. And here's the quirky tidbit for you. In some fringe versions, Apollo doesn't just accept the lyre. He gifts Hermes a staff in return, the very caduceus that would later become his signature, complete with 2 intertwining serpents. Yes, that same symbol you've probably seen on ambulances and medical logos. Imagine explaining that, "Oh, this universal symbol of healing. Yeah, it started because a baby trickster stole some cows and then swapped them for a guitar prototype." Medicine has never felt so musically improvised. But even with the lyre in his possession, Apollo isn't entirely appeased. The balance between them is shifting, sure, but a sibling rivalry this intense doesn't dissolve overnight. You can almost picture Apollo sighing once more, the way someone reluctantly admits their little brother might actually be useful. The two gods stand together now, framed by golden sunset light. Apollo strums softly, testing the instrument, while Hermes hums a nonsense tune under his breath. For the first time in this entire saga, they're not enemies but uneasy collaborators, like roommates who argue over the thermostat but still split the rent. And that perhaps is the real magic of Hermes' invention, not the sound itself, but the fragile bridge it built between two gods who couldn't have been more different. One who embodied order, the other chaos. One who valued structure, the other improvisation. And for a fleeting moment, music held them in harmony. You lean back, letting the meadows quiet wash over you, the cows grazing lazily, the brothers caught in their own rhythm. Even as the sun dips and shadows stretch long, the sound of the lyre lingers, timeless and steady, as though promising that despite the mischief, despite the arguments, something beautiful can come from even the most ridiculous heist. The lyre's last shimmering note drifts into twilight, and you can practically feel Apollo recalibrating his pride. He has a new instrument, true, but he still has a problem. Cows don't exactly herd themselves back home. And Hermes, sitting cross-legged like the picture of cherubic guilt, doesn't seem inclined to lend a hand. The cattle shuffle restlessly in the fading light, their broad silhouettes stretching across the meadow. One flicks its tail against the buzzing gnats. Another lets out a half-hearted bellow that echoes like a slow-motion complaint. You trail behind Apollo as he sighs deeply, strums a calming chord on the lyre, and mutters something that sounds suspiciously like, "I should have just raised goats." Apollo steps forward, clapping his hands in that exaggerated way you've seen modern farmers do when they're trying to convince 30 confused animals to walk in the same direction. The cows look at him blankly, chewing cud, clearly unconvinced. A divine glow might work on mortals, but cattle, they don't care about your solar aura, buddy. Hermes, ever the opportunist, decides to make things worse, or better, depending on how you see it. He picks up a reed flute, where did he even get that? And begins piping a jaunty little tune. The cows, bless them, suddenly shuffle toward the sound, wobbling like oversized toddlers at a dance recital. Apollo glares at him, though secretly you can see the gears turning. Maybe this could actually work. And so begins one of the least dignified scenes in Greek mythology. Apollo, god of archery and prophecy, waving his arms like a frustrated shepherd. while Hermes, still basically a toddler, tootles away on a flute to get the cows moving. You trudge after them, half amused, half hypnotized by the absurdity. Here's your mainstream historical fact of the night. Ancient Greeks did herd cattle and sheep with music, or at least rhythmic sounds. Shepherds used pipes and simple flutes not just to pass the time, but also to influence the movement of animals, proving that livestock are as susceptible to a good beat as humans at a wedding. In some places, bells were tied to animals' necks, turning whole herds into accidental orchestras every time they moved. And because no myth is ever content with being ordinary, here comes the quirky tidbit. One obscure telling claims that Hermes didn't just invent the lyre that day. He also invented sandals specifically to make sneaking around easier while herding. Yes, the world's first pair of flip-flops, allegedly designed for cattle theft. Fashion meets function, ancient Greek edition. You almost want Nike to rebrand with that origin story. Now, let's slide into the debate. Historians still argue whether Apollo truly forgave Hermes during this cow-herding fiasco, or if the reconciliation was patched over much later by Zeus. Some versions present Apollo as immediately smitten by the lyre and willing to forgive. Others insist that he dragged Hermes all the way to Olympus for divine arbitration. In either case, the cows became an odd sort of bargaining chip, half ransom, half peace treaty. The herd finally stumbles into motion, though not without chaos. One stubborn bull veers toward a patch of wildflowers, ignoring Apollo's attempts to redirect it. Hermes smirks, lifts his flute, and plays a sharp little trill. Magically, or maybe just musically, the bull turns back into line. Apollo mutters something about never again trusting newborns with cattle, but you notice he stopped frowning. Night falls fully now, stars dripping across the sky like spilled sugar. The herd trudges onward under the glow of constellations, their hooves pressing the earth in steady rhythm. You follow behind, lulled by the sound of the lyre mingling with Hermes' piping, the occasional low moo punctuating the harmony. It's messy, ungraceful, and oddly perfect. Somewhere between the pasture and Apollo's divine stables, you realize this whole ridiculous parade is more than just a story about cows. It's a myth about control, about how even gods can't always manage the simplest things, like convincing a herd to move left instead of right. And yet in the clumsy push and pull of sibling rivalry, something new is born. Music, compromise, and a shared melody that even stubborn cattle can follow. By the time the herd is corralled, Apollo is no longer furious. Exhausted maybe, annoyed definitely. But he plucks another chord on the lyre and Hermes answers with a playful whistle, their sounds colliding in the warm night air. And you, half drowsy now, feel as though you've stumbled into the first ever jam session, one where the audience is 50 cows and the stakes are nothing less than sibling peace. The herd is finally clustered inside the makeshift enclosure, if you can even call a few stakes and some divine willpower an enclosure. The cows stand chewing, tails flicking, clearly unimpressed by the amount of godly effort it took to get them there. You can't help but notice Apollo leaning on his lyre like a walking stick, breathing with the kind of exhaustion you'd expect from someone who's just fought a battle, not wrangled a bunch of bovines. Hermes, meanwhile, squats near the gate, grinning like he's orchestrated the most successful prank in the history of Mount Olympus. His little reed flute dangles loosely in his hands, and he's humming as though this were all some harmless game. You sidle closer, almost expecting him to break into a full stand-up routine about the world's most reluctant cattle rancher. Apollo, for his part, straightens his shoulders, attempting to reassert dignity. You'd think a golden glow and a perfectly combed head of hair would help, but nope, he still looks like a guy who just spent 3 hours shouting at cows. He clears his throat, strums a bold chord, and declares, "These animals need order." The cows blink. One lets out a long, low moo that sounds suspiciously like laughter. You almost want to clap along. Apollo tries again, using the lyre as both a baton and a motivational soundtrack. He plays a lilting melody, walking slowly in front of the herd, and to your surprise it works at least partially. The cows sway side to side, stepping in a loose rhythm, as if the meadow has suddenly turned into an outdoor dance floor. Hermes chuckles, muttering, "See, music makes better herdsmen than pride." That comment nearly earns him a divine glare strong enough to scorch sandals, but Apollo is too busy experimenting. Higher notes seem to quicken the herd's pace, deeper ones calm them. He's inadvertently turned this whole mess into the first known exercise in cow choreography. Here's your mainstream fact. Ancient Greeks genuinely believed music had power over living beings and even nature itself. Pythagoras and his followers suggested certain harmonies could heal, align the soul, and bring order to chaos. Shepherds playing flutes for animals wasn't just pastime, it was believed to have practical influence. If Pythagoras had shown up right now, he'd probably have taken notes. And for your quirky tidbit, there's a later story, possibly apocryphal, that cows in the Peloponnese were said to give more milk when exposed to specific types of singing. Imagine the earliest form of lo-fi beats to relax and lactate too. You wonder if Apollo stumbled across that little discovery here by accident. Of course, historians still argue whether this whole episode was mythic allegory or simply ancient comedy. Some claim it reflects a moral about humility, how even gods must bow to mundane tasks. Others say it's satire, a playful dig at Apollo's serious reputation, much like if you caught your boss at the office holiday party trying to karaoke after too many drinks. Either way, this debate ensures the story lingers far beyond its bovine audience. Back in the meadow, Hermes decides it's his turn to one-up his older brother. He picks up a stick, dips it in the dirt, and starts drawing crude little symbols, as if mapping out cow strategies. Apollo sighs but can't resist peeking. It looks like a board game gone wrong, squiggly lines leading to circles, arrows pointing in every direction. Hermes declares it the science of cow logistics, and insists it will revolutionize Olympus. You suppress a chuckle. Who knew bedtime Mischief could invent half a dozen new disciplines at once? But the cows are calm. They're no longer wandering, no longer threatening to bolt for the nearest patch of weeds. Instead, they stand in semi-organized clusters, lowing softly under the glow of stars. For a fleeting moment, Apollo looks almost content, as though he's finally accepted that dignity can be found even in the most ridiculous tasks. You walk among them, brushing past warm flanks and twitching ears, and it feels oddly grounding. These are divine cattle, sure, but they're still just animals, beings that chew, breathe, and sleep without fretting about pride or sibling rivalries. In their slow, steady rhythms, you sense the hidden heartbeat of myth itself, a reminder that even the gods, for all their power, sometimes have to deal with the smell of manure. By the time Apollo steps back, his lyre slung loosely at his side, the meadow is quiet. Hermes stretches, yawns theatrically, and declares the night's work a triumph. And you, well, you're halfway between amusement and sleep, lulled by the steady background chorus of 50 contented cows, as if the myth itself is settling down for the night. The meadow has gone hushed now, the cows breathing in that steady, sleepy rhythm that almost sounds like waves brushing ashore. Apollo leans against the fence, cradling his lyre, his golden hair dimmed by starlight. Hermes, of course, refuses to sit still. He skips between the cows, tugging at their tails, whispering little jokes into their ears as though he expects them to chuckle back. You trail behind, half expecting one of the animals to get fed up and kick him, but somehow they tolerate the mischief. Maybe they recognize divinity in miniature form, or maybe they're just too tired to care. Apollo finally breaks the silence with a weary sigh. Cattle, he says like it's the punchline to an inside joke, are not my destiny. You nod, though silently. You're glad his destiny wasn't carpentry either, because you wouldn't trust him with a hammer after seeing how he struggled with a herd. Hermes seizes the moment to puff up his tiny chest. Well, perhaps it is mine, he declares, waving his reed flute like a general brandishing a sword. I can herd, I can play, I can invent sandals, and now look. He points to a cow scratching its flank against the fence post. They even listen to me when I tell them where to scratch. Apollo smirks but doesn't argue. Instead, he plucks a gentle, rolling melody on the lyre, softer than before, like he's finally accepted the night's strange circumstances. And wouldn't you know it, the cows shuffle a little closer, forming a semicircle around him, their eyes heavy-lidded, their jaws slowing. Apollo, the god of music, prophecy, and the sun, has accidentally discovered that cattle enjoy lullabies. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greeks firmly tied music to rest and healing. Temples dedicated to Escalates, the god of medicine, sometimes used songs or rhythmic chants to soothe patients. The idea that sound could lull the mind wasn't just a poetic notion, it was part of daily practice. Tonight, You're watching that logic play out with cows as test subjects. And for the quirky tidbit, one fragment from later Greek folklore claims Apollo's cattle weren't ordinary at all, but emitted faint musical notes when they mooed, like living instruments. Imagine a pasture full of tubas and clarinets disguised as livestock. You wonder if Hermes had that in mind when he decided they'd make the perfect target for his prank. Now, onto the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this myth should be read literally or symbolically. Some say it's a cautionary tale about theft and forgiveness. Others claim it represents the clash of two archetypes, Hermes as trickster, Apollo as order-bringer. Still others point to agricultural rights, suggesting the story mirrors seasonal cycles of loss and return in the herds. As always, the academics manage to make it even sleepier, which, frankly, is great for you right now. Back in the meadow, Hermes yawns dramatically and plops onto the grass, propping his head on his hands as if waiting for applause. So, he says, "Do you forgive me now?" Apollo doesn't answer immediately. He stares at the stars, strums another lazy chord, and finally mutters, "We'll see." It's not exactly forgiveness, but it's not divine wrath either. You get the sense the lyre has already softened him, stitched a quiet truce into the night air. And you, standing there under the sweep of constellations, feel caught in the in-between. The absurdity of gods arguing over cows, and the strange serenity of music settling beasts into silence. It's both ridiculous and calming, like watching someone knit socks during a thunderstorm. The cows shift, lie down in the grass one by one, their massive bodies thudding softly into the earth. The herd has given up, surrendered to the song, and in that surrender, even Apollo seems to relax. His melody slows, stretching into longer pauses as though he's playing not for them anymore, but for himself and maybe, in some small way, for you too. By the time the cows have fully surrendered to sleep, the meadow feels like a giant breathing blanket. The night hums with the low buzz of insects, the whisper of grass shifting in the breeze, and somewhere above, the faint rustle of wings, perhaps an owl, perhaps one of Zeus's nosy eagles, checking in on the drama from above. Apollo reclines against a fence post, his lyre balanced loosely across his knees. He plucks at the strings without urgency, producing notes that shimmer and fade like drops of water falling into a well. It's a song that doesn't really go anywhere, but that's the point. It drifts, it meanders, it circles back, perfect for a night when cattle are finally calm. Hermes, meanwhile, is sprawled out in the grass, clearly more proud of himself than he has any right to be. He kicks his little legs in the air, whistling along to Apollo's tune, completely unbothered by the fact that this entire debacle began because of him. You almost admire his nerve. Almost. "Admit it," Hermes says at last, stretching like a cat. "I've given you something priceless." Apollo raises an eyebrow. "A headache," he deadpans. Hermes giggles. "No, brother, music. Without me you'd still just be yelling at cows." Apollo doesn't answer, but the corners of his mouth twitch upward. There's truth in it. Out of mischief came melody, and out of chaos came rhythm. That's sort of Hermes's whole brand. Stir up trouble, watch beauty accidentally fall out of it. Here's tonight's mainstream historical fact. The myth of Apollo and Hermes was often used in antiquity to explain not just the invention of the lyre, but the origins of barter, exchange, and even compromise. After all, Hermes traded the lyre to Apollo in return for peace over the stolen cows. It's one of the earliest mythic explanations for negotiation, because apparently even gods need receipts. And now for the quirky tidbit. One obscure commentary claims Hermes didn't stop at inventing the lyre that night. Supposedly, he also crafted the first dice using sheep knuckle bones, teaching Apollo a gambling game while they watched the herd. Whether that was a bonding activity or just Hermes trying to hustle his brother out of pocket change, no one's quite sure. You imagine Apollo sighing as Hermes cheers, "Double sixes again," while the cows look on unimpressed. Of course, scholars still argue whether Hermes actually gave the lyre willingly, or whether Zeus had to step in and force a reconciliation. Some versions have Apollo threatening thunderous revenge. Others show Hermes handing it over like a peace offering. And still others claim Hermes never really stopped bragging about how clever he was. The debate leaves you wondering if sibling grudges in Olympus were just as messy as the ones in your own family group chat. Back in the meadow, the two brothers lapse into a strange companionship. Hermes fiddles with blades of grass, weaving them into something vaguely crown-shaped, while Apollo closes his eyes, letting his fingers wander across the strings. The sound is warm, steady, and hypnotic, weaving into the night air until even you feel your eyelids grow heavy. The cows, now nothing more than shadowy mounds in the starlight, grunt softly in their sleep. One lets out a half-snore, half-moo, startling Hermes into giggles. Apollo rolls his eyes, but doesn't stop playing. It's as though the god of music himself has accepted that sometimes your audience is 50 unconscious cows and one mischievous little brother, and that's enough. You settle into the grass yourself, the ground cool and slightly damp beneath your palms. Overhead, constellations wheel slowly, silent witnesses to the most unglamorous of divine nights. For all the grandeur of myth, for all the thunderbolts and prophecies, sometimes history remembers the silly evenings too, the ones where gods herd cows, invent instruments, and learn that even chaos has a rhythm. And as the lyre's notes linger in the air, you realize you're not just following a bedtime story. You're inside a lullaby, one that's older than you, older than Apollo, and older than the myths themselves. The meadow breathes on as if it, too, has finally decided to nap. You lean back, staring upward, where stars look like tiny spilled pearls across black velvet. Somewhere out there, you imagine constellations laughing at the absurdity of two gods babysitting cattle. Orion probably has his bow pointed, but not at monsters, more likely at a cow that strayed too far from the group. Apollo, now fully invested in his playing, begins to shape a melody more purposeful than before. The notes string together, weaving something that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby. It's gentle, lilting, just the right amount of repetitive, the kind of tune that could make you forget tomorrow exists. You can almost see invisible lines stretching from the lyre's frame to the cow's twitching ears, tethering their dreams. Hermes, on the other hand, has decided that music needs commentary. He hums along in tuneless exaggeration, making trumpet noises with his mouth, then breaking into fake applause. Bravo, Apollo, a sold-out show in the pasture of dreams. Apollo pretends not to hear, but the corners of his lips give him away. He's trying not to smile. The cows, for their part, shuffle in their sleep, forming neat rows as though the music has nudged them into some subconscious choreography. One even flicks its tail in time with the rhythm. You think, this might be the world's first cattle concert, unrecorded by history but very real to the grass, the stars, and now to you. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greece, herding wasn't just about keeping animals in line. It was tied deeply to wealth, prestige, and even social rituals. Owning cattle could mean status, sacrifices, and trade, making Apollo's irritation over stolen cows more than just vanity. In other words, Hermes didn't swipe toys, he meddled with economy. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest Hermes's prank was a kind of satire on aristocratic herding culture. Think of it this way. While noble families boasted about their vast herds, Hermes reduced the whole business to a game of hide-and-seek. It's like sneaking into a billionaire's garage, moving all the cars around, and then claiming it was a lesson in humility. Yet historians still argue whether this myth was meant as a light-hearted origin tale for music, or a veiled jab at power dynamics between gods. Was Apollo truly furious, or just annoyed enough to go along with Hermes's antics because he knew he'd get a song out of it? No one agrees. The myth survives in multiple versions, all equally contradictory, like gossip retold at too many symposiums. Apollo pauses his strumming for a moment and gazes out across the field. His golden hair, usually blinding in sunlight, now glimmers faintly under starlight, muted and soft. For once, he seems less like a god and more like someone who just wants the night to end peacefully. Hermes notices and in an uncharacteristically quiet gesture tosses his woven grass crown toward his brother. It lands lopsided on Apollo's head. "King of cows," Hermes whispers with a grin. Apollo doesn't correct him. He just plucks the next note, letting it resonate. The sound rolls across the meadow, brushing against the grass and the drowsy cattle. You catch yourself yawning, lulled by the steady pulse of string against finger, the softness of air on your skin, the realization that maybe, just maybe, even divine rivalries can be soothed by music. The night stretches longer, the stars shift slightly, and the meadow seems to sink into itself, as though the earth is tucking its children, gods, cows, and you, under a blanket woven from sound and silence. And in that moment, you can't help but marvel that the entire myth of Apollo's cows has led not to vengeance, not to drama, but to this strange, tender quiet. The night refuses to rush. You sit with it, listening as Apollo's lyre strings loosen their grip on rhythm. The music has thinned into long pauses, the kind where silence becomes its own note. Each gap stretches wider until sound barely threads through at all. You feel yourself leaning into the quiet, your breath syncing with the cow's slow exhalations. Somewhere a cricket chirps, then thinks better of it, falling into stillness too. Apollo sets the lyre across his lap, running his thumb absently over one silent string. Hermes, usually restless, is still for once. His mischievous grin has softened into something gentler, less sharp-edged. He leans back on his elbows, staring skyward as though counting how many stars might be keeping score of this ridiculous night. Neither of them seems in a hurry to return to Olympus. Why would they? The meadow is calm, the cows obedient in sleep, and the universe has temporarily agreed to stop being dramatic. You catch the faintest smell of hay warming under starlight, mingling with the dew settling in the grass. It is such a minor detail, so ordinary, yet it feels like the finishing brushstroke on this bizarre divine experiment in cow herding. You laugh softly to yourself, realizing the gods' greatest achievement tonight was not vengeance or theft, but inventing a lullaby strong enough to tame boredom. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Music in ancient Greece wasn't mere entertainment. It was considered essential for education, healing, and even moral character. Apollo, as god of music, embodied that belief. His melodies were thought to bring order to chaos. And in this sleepy meadow, you witness that principle in action, cows and all. The quirky tidbit. Some ancient commentators hinted that Apollo's lyre playing might have been the first ever cattle lullaby, a playful exaggeration, but one that stuck. Imagine, the god of light reduced, for one night, to a celestial farmhand strumming livestock into slumber. If myths had tabloids, the headline would read, "Sun God trades bow for barn duty." But historians still argue whether this story was ever meant to be taken literally. Was it a parody of divine egos, a myth about the birth of music, or just a rustic comedy told to make children giggle around the fire? The scholarly ink has spilled endlessly, yet the cows remain unbothered. Apollo plucks one last note, soft, almost fragile, and lets it fade into the horizon. Hermes exhales through his nose, a quiet chuckle. "Not bad for a night shift," he murmurs. You sense the rivalry hasn't ended, not really. It has only paused, smoothed into something tolerable by fatigue. Tomorrow they'll spar again, trade insults, steal things back and forth. But tonight they share a silence too heavy to break. The meadow itself seems to exhale. Grass bends with the weight of dew, stars tilt slightly westward, and the earth feels like it has settled into bed. The cows twitch in dreams, chasing who knows what endless fields, divine grass, perhaps even melodies themselves. You close your eyes for a moment, and when you open them, nothing has changed except the heaviness in your limbs. The gods remain there, one crowned in grass, the other crowned in golden silence. The myth has finished not with a bang but a long, slow sigh. And now, as the meadow lingers in its stillness, you find your own body slowing to match its rhythm. Your breathing stretches longer, softer, almost like it belongs to the cows resting nearby. The story of Apollo and Hermes drifts behind you, unraveling like smoke from a fading fire. Each detail, the stolen herd, the music under stars, the gentle rivalry, slips further away, until it feels less like a tale and more like a dream already half forgotten. The air around you grows thicker with quiet wrapping close, pulling you deeper into the space between waking and sleep. You let your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclench, and your thoughts wander no further than the steady pulse of calm. The meadow has become your blanket, the night sky your ceiling, the hush of divine music your pillow. There is no need to follow Apollo or Hermes any longer. Their story has ended, their laughter dimmed, their rivalry paused. All that remains is the slow rhythm of breath and the gentle weight of stillness. You can let yourself drift with it, as though you, too, are a cow drowsing in the tall grass, content and unhurried. The stars overhead no longer demand your attention. They can keep shining without you. Your only task now is to rest, to surrender to the softness that has been waiting all along. With each exhale, you let go of one more strand of wakefulness, until the story fades entirely, leaving nothing but the quiet hum of sleep. And with that, the meadow, the gods, the cows, all of it, dissolves into silence. You are safe, you are calm, you are already halfway to dreaming.